Wyoming Territory, 1873, the wind had teeth that day, dragging dust across the basin like it meant to scrub the bones from the land. Odessa Clarke had not cried when her husband died, or when the ranch burned, or even when she buried her father under a crooked pine just north of the Bighorn foothills. But standing in front of that quiet homestead with nothing but two frightened children at her sides, she felt her throat tighten. "Mama," little Ruthie whispered, her chin trembling. Odessa dropped to one knee, pulling both children close. "We're going to be all right," she said, though the words tasted like ash. "We just have to keep moving." The man who had promised to take care of them had left her with debts and empty fields. The neighbors had taken what they could, and the banker had taken the rest. She had one mule, a wagon with a cracked wheel, and hope worn thin as thread. They made it 2 days south before the mule gave out, collapsing in the middle of the prairie road. Odessa lifted her skirts and carried Ruthie, while 9-year-old Reuben walked beside her in silence. By dusk, her boots were soaked through, and her feet bled. That night, the children cried themselves to sleep beneath a sky full of hard stars, and Odessa sat awake with a knife in her hand. She was not afraid of wolves. She was afraid of what would happen if no one came. Someone did. The next morning, a rider crested the ridge tall in the saddle, his long coat dusted pale. He stopped when he saw them, dismounted and approached on foot. His eyes were a deep brown, the color of river stones. His hat shadowed his face, but Odessa noticed the way his hand rested near his holster, not threatening, just cautious. "You folks all right?" he asked, voice low, rough from wind and silence. "No," she said plainly. "The mule died. We have nowhere to go." He looked at the children, then back at Odessa. "You from around here?" "Used to be," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded once. "Name's Osric Callahan." "Odessa Clarke," she replied. "My children are Reuben and Ruthie." Osric tipped his hat toward the children. "There's a ranch about a mile west. My place. You can come with me. I got food in a wagon, safer than out here." She hesitated, gripping the knife tighter. "I ain't looking to hurt you," he added. "You can ride in the wagon. I'll walk beside it. Kids can eat, rest." Ruthie tugged at her skirt. "Mama," she whispered, "I'm so hungry." Odessa looked at Osric again. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, maybe a little more, with hands calloused from work, not cruelty. She nodded. They rode in quiet. Osric did not speak unless spoken to. He watched the road and held the reins like he had done it 1,000 times, like the weight of the world did not bother him. When they reached the ranch, a modest spread tucked among cottonwoods, he helped the children down before offering Odessa his hand. She did not take it. Still, he did not look offended. He showed them the pump out back, the shed with blankets, the wash basin. He gave Odessa a tin plate piled with cornbread, beans, and rabbit stew. Then he left her alone with the children. That night, Odessa sat on the porch steps, watching the moon rise. Osric was in the corral, brushing down a black gelding. "You live here alone?" she asked suddenly. He nodded. "Since '69. No family, had a brother, died in Kansas. Before that, the war." She looked down. "My husband went east, never came back. Died owing more than he left behind." Silence stretched between them. "You're kind," she said finally. Osric shrugged. "Not kind, just know what it's like to be left with nothing." Over the next few days, Osric brought firewood, repaired the wagon wheel, and let Reuben help with the horses. He showed Ruthie how to gather eggs without cracking them. He never pried, never asked more than he gave. Odessa tried not to count how often she looked toward the barn just to see if he was nearby. One morning, she found him mending a fence. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt, and his hands moved with calm purpose. He looked up when she approached, eyes narrowing from the sun. "You planning to stay?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," she said. "I could give you work. It ain't much, but you'd have a roof. The kids could go to the schoolhouse come spring." Odessa looked at his hands, rough, cracked across the knuckles. She looked at the scar above his brow, at the way he avoided her eyes. "You do not talk much." He gave a faint nod. "Never saw the use." She stepped closer. "And love. Have you ever spoken of that?" He turned away, jaw tight. "No." She reached out and touched his hand. His fingers twitched beneath hers like he had not been touched in years. Then he looked at her, really looked, and something cracked wide open in his face, like a dam giving way. "Do not leave me," he said, voice hoarse, her breath caught. I do not want to be alone again, he added. You brought life back to this place without trying. I do not know how to say it right, but if you go, it all goes quiet again. Odessa stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart. I was not planning to leave, she said. He closed his eyes like the words were a prayer. And when he opened them, he looked at her as if she was the first dawn after a long, dark winter. Osric didn't say another word that day, not after Odessa's hand settled over his chest like it belonged there. He finished setting the last post in the fence, then walked back to the barn without looking over his shoulder. She watched him go, her fingers still tingling with the memory of his skin beneath them, rough, warm, steady. Reuben sat cross-legged near the woodpile with a whittling knife Osric had let him borrow. Ruthie was curled up in the hayloft, her doll tucked under her arm. Odessa stayed outside until the wind shifted and the clouds pulled long across the sky. That night, after both children were sleeping, she heard Osric on the porch. His boots made no sound on the boards, but the door eased open slow, and she could see his shape framed by moonlight. He didn't come inside. I've got a small cabin out toward the creek, he said. Built it for my brother before he passed. If you want it, it's yours. She folded the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Why haven't you used it? Couldn't bring myself to. Still had his coat hanging on the peg for years. But I cleared it out last week. You thought we'd stay that long. I hoped. She rose and joined him on the step. The cold pressed against her skin, but she didn't move away. Why didn't you say anything before now? He kept his eyes on the horizon. Words never came easy. Especially not the ones that matter. Odessa sat beside him, knees tucked under her skirt. Tell me something you never said out loud. Osric was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, I buried my brother with my father's watch, should have kept it. But I couldn't stand the sound of it ticking alone in a drawer. She looked at him, the curve of his jaw stark in the light. You ever think about leaving this place? He shook his head. Every time I've gone looking for something better, I came back with less. In the morning, Odessa packed what little they had and followed Osric down a narrow trail through cottonwoods to the cabin. It wasn't much, one room, stone hearth, small porch, but the roof held and the windows were sound. He handed her a ring of iron keys, each one shaped a little different. I'll be in the north field most days, he said. You need something, send Reuben. She studied his face. His mouth was tight, but not with distance, with effort. You don't owe us this. He met her eyes. Owing's got nothing to do with it. The first night in the cabin, Odessa sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the creek murmur just beyond the window. Ruthie slept between her and Reuben, their breathing soft and even. The silence no longer felt empty. Weeks passed. The ground hardened with frost. Odessa began mending for Osric, patching shirts and darning socks without being asked. In return, he brought her coffee beans and a jar of apple preserves from a neighbor's trade. They spoke little, but she learned the rhythm of his days, how he moved slower before sunrise, how he favored his right leg on cold mornings, how he always paused at the barn door like he was listening for something only he could hear. Late one evening, Odessa found him repairing a saddle by lantern light. She stepped into the barn, arms crossed to keep the warmth trapped under her shawl. I've been thinking, she said. He didn't look up. About what? About that quiet way you live. It's not fear, is it? It's choice. His hands stilled over the leather strap. Some things, if you say them, they lose their weight. She stepped closer. And if you never say them, they stay where they belong. Odessa knelt beside him. Maybe they belong with someone else now. He looked at her then, really looked, the lantern's glow catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. You scare me, he said softly. Why? Because you see me. She reached for his hand again, not tentative this time. He didn't pull away. I don't want to be seen by anyone else, she whispered. He turned his palm to cradle hers. You don't have to leave, Odessa, not ever. I wasn't planning to. Neither of them moved. The barn was warm with the scent of hay and leather and the slow, steady breath of horses. Outside, snow began to fall quiet, patient, like something long hoped for finally arriving. By early December, the creek had crusted over with thin ice and the cottonwoods stood bare, their limbs reaching like brittle hands toward a pale sky. The cabin held heat well enough if the stove was fed regular, and Odessa had learned how to strike the flue just right, so the smoke pulled clean. Each morning began with the sound of Reuben chopping kindling and Ruthie humming low as she mashed boiled apples for breakfast. Odessa's hands were never still. She stitched, boiled lye soap, scrubbed Ruthie's stockings on a washboard till her knuckles cracked. But it wasn't the work that filled her chest with breath again. It was the way the quiet no longer pressed in from all sides. It was the way Osric's presence steady, unspoken, kept the air warm even when he wasn't near. He came by late most afternoons, always with something in hand: a sack of oats, a block of salt, once a bundle of corn husks for Ruthie to make dolls. He never lingered long, but he always looked at Odessa before he left, like he was still trying to puzzle out how she'd come to exist in his world. One evening, she caught him just as he was tying his horse outside the gate. He turned when he heard her boots in the snow. "Reuben found a rusted trap by the edge of the creek," she said. "I buried it, but I thought you should know." Osric frowned. "That's the third one this month. Someone hunting without asking, likely." Trappers pass through this time of year, looking for beaver downstream. He glanced toward the tree line. "I'll walk the boundary tomorrow. I'll come with you." He studied her face, then gave a short nod. "Dress warm." They left at dawn, Ruthie wrapped in quilts with Reuben watching over her like he'd been born older than his years. Odessa walked beside Osric in silence, rifle slung across her back, scarf tucked tight around her mouth. The snow lay undisturbed along the north fence line, marred only by rabbit tracks and the faint drag of brush across the wind. They found the first trap near a shallow bend in the creek, half buried in frozen mud. Osric kneeled, pried it loose, and tossed it into his pack without a word. He found another before noon, this one baited fresh. "Someone's working close," he said, "not more than a day or two ahead of us. Do you think they know we're here? They will soon." They kept moving, the sun low and gold behind them. Odessa's breath frosted at her cheeks, but her legs stayed firm beneath her. She didn't speak until they reached the high bluff overlooking the valley. Osric stopped there, gaze reaching out across the land like it belonged to him. "You've walked this line how many winters?" she asked. "Every one since I staked the claim." "Ever think about building a second fence closer in?" He shook his head. "I'd rather know what's coming than wall it out." She looked at him then, really looked, his eyes fixed on the far ridge, brow drawn like he was listening to something beneath the wind. "You ever think about what you'd do if someone stayed?" she asked. He didn't turn. "I wouldn't know how to ask him to. You already did." He looked at her then, slow, like turning toward something he hadn't let himself believe was real. "I meant it, I know." The wind picked up and she stepped closer. He didn't move away. The air between them was cold, but his nearness made her forget it. "You said you didn't want to be alone again," she said. "Neither do I." Osric reached for her hand, not sudden, not shy, just certain, and held it like he'd been waiting his whole life to do so. His skin was rough, but his grip was gentle. He didn't speak, not right away. Then, quiet as the snow falling around them, he said, "I never thought this land could feel full." She leaned into him, shoulder to shoulder. "It does now." They didn't kiss, not there on the bluff with the wind biting and the sky turning purple with dusk. But something passed between them, solid, unspoken, and rooted deep as the cottonwoods that said everything that words could not. They turned back together, walking side by side through the snow, the path behind them marked by two sets of tracks where once there had only been one. Winter deepened. Ice webbed the water troughs, and the horse's breath hung thick in the barn air. Days passed in smaller tasks, mending tack in the warmth of the shed, boiling potatoes with salt pork, teaching Ruthie to count stitches with a dull needle and a scrap of muslin. Reuben started rising before full light, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to help hitch the team or check the traps laid along the edge of the property. No one asked him to grow up fast. He simply did. Osric didn't come every day anymore. He came when there was need: a broken hinge on the cabin door, a fox stealing eggs, but mostly he let her be. It wasn't distance, it was space, a quiet sort of reverence. And Odessa found herself watching the trail from the porch, not from worry, but from want. One morning she found a sack leaning against the doorframe. Inside, a folded wool shawl, thick and dark blue, and a paper-wrapped parcel of molasses sugar. No note, just the things left like a promise. That afternoon, while Reuben stacked dried thistle for kindling and Ruthie played with her husk doll beneath the table, Odessa walked the trail alone. The sky was flat with cloud, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. She found Osric behind the barn, kneeling to check a cracked wheel hub on the seed cart. "You always fix things before they break?" she asked. He glanced up, then returned to his work. "If I can." "You left something at the cabin." He wiped his hands on a scrap of cotton and stood. "Didn't reckon you'd want me knocking. I would have answered." She stepped closer. "You think I don't see you trying?" He looked off toward the horses, his jaw working like something stuck behind his teeth. "I don't want to press too close. You already are close." He hesitated. "I don't always know where the line is." She touched the sleeve of his coat, fingers catching on the worn seam. "You don't have to guess with me." Osric's hand hovered in the air, uncertain, before resting over hers gently. He looked down at their hands, then back up to her face, and something shifted in his eyes, not surprise, not fear, but the beginning of belief. "You ever think about what comes after the thaw?" he asked. "I think about planting," she said. "I think about the roof needing tar before the spring rains." "That's not what I meant." "I know," he swallowed. "I don't have much, just this land and what I can hold together with my hands. I don't need more than that." They stood quiet for a while. The wind pressed against the boards of the barn behind them, and a crow called from somewhere beyond the ridge. "I never asked a woman to stay," he said. "Never figured I deserved it." Odessa reached up and brushed a bit of sawdust from the edge of his collar. "You never had to deserve me. You just had to be kind." He stepped back, not away, but enough to pull something from his coat pocket. A bone-handled clasp knife, worn smooth with use. "This was my brother's," he said. "He gave it to me when we came west. Said it was for carving something worth keeping." He pressed it into her palm, then closed her fingers around it. "I want you to have it." She looked down at the knife, then up at him. "You sure?" He nodded once. "I ain't got words for what's between us. But I know it's real." Odessa tucked the knife into her apron pocket. "Then you won't be alone again." Osric's shoulders eased, the lines around his mouth softening as he exhaled. "Come spring," he said, "I want to build another room on the cabin. One with space enough for all of you. We'll need shelves," she said, "and a place for Ruthie's dolls, and hooks for Reuben's tools, and a window that faces east." He smiled, slow and unguarded. "So you can see the sun when it breaks." "No," she said, stepping close again. "So I can see you coming down the trail." He didn't answer this time. He just reached for her hand again and held it like he meant to never let it go. By mid-February, the snow crusted hard in the mornings, brittle enough to crack under a boot heel. The days stretched longer, the sun hanging over the ridge just a breath past supper. Reuben had taken to spending his afternoons in the barn loft, sketching the horses with charcoal stub ends on flattened flour sacks. Ruthie followed Odessa from room to room, asking about every jar on the shelf, every button in the mending tin. Osric began bringing lumber down from the North Woods 2 boards slung across his shoulder at a time, saying little, but measuring the cabin wall with a carpenter's eye. He marked out the corners for the new room using a length of twine and a willow switch. He never asked for help, but when Odessa stepped beside him with a basket of nails and a hammer in hand, he made room without hesitation. "Was your brother good with his hands?" she asked as she steadied the plank he'd braced against the frame. "He was clever. Could fix anything with half the parts missing. I mostly followed behind, learning slow." "You build careful," she said. "Like you expect someone to lean on every wall." He nodded, not glancing up. "Figure if it's meant to hold a life, it ought to be strong enough." That night, she found him sitting by the creek, sharpening a drawknife by lantern light. The ice had thinned, and water moved beneath it with a muffled hush. She sat beside him, knees brushing his. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. Osric didn't look startled, just waited. "I used to play fiddle, before Ruthie was born. My father traded 3 chickens and a sack of barley for it when I was 16. I left it behind when we fled the fire." She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I hear the tune still when it's quiet." He nodded slowly. "There's a fiddle in the attic, my mother's. I never knew how to string it." She turned to him, eyes wide. "Ruthie might remember the songs," he added softly, "if you taught her." She laid her hand over his. I want to stay, she said, not just through spring, not just until the children are grown. His grip tightened, steady and sure. Then you're home now. They married in early March, with the ground just soft enough to hold the fence posts Osric reset that morning. Reverend Haskett rode in from town with a Bible wrapped in oilcloth and a worn stole tucked beneath his coat. Ruthie carried a bundle of dried wildflowers, and Reuben stood straight as a fence post in a too-large vest Osric had tailored down from his own. They said their vows on the porch, the new room not yet finished, but the frame strong and square behind them. Odessa wore her mother's brooch pinned at the throat of her best dress, and Osric had combed his hair flat and clean behind his ears. When the Reverend asked if they would honor and keep one another, come what may, neither hesitated. Afterward, Odessa set a kettle on the stove and sliced the last of the winter apples thin, layering them with brown sugar and biscuit dough. Osric carved a block of cheddar they'd been saving and passed tin cups of cider around the table. Ruthie clambered into his lap halfway through supper and fell asleep there with her mouth sticky from syrup. Reuben leaned against Odessa's shoulder and didn't flinch when she kissed the top of his head. That night, after the children were tucked in and the fire banked low, Osric took Odessa's hand and led her to the edge of the new room. The floorboards were still bare, but he'd hung a lantern from the rafter beam and laid a quilt down over the planks. We'll finish it together, he said. Every board, every nail. She touched the beam above their heads. It already feels like ours, he kissed her then. Not tentative, not hurried, just quiet and true, like every word he hadn't spoken had been waiting for that moment to find form. Spring came slow. The creek swelled, and wild onions pushed up through the thawed soil. Odessa planted rows of beans and squash while Reuben built a scarecrow to guard them, using Osric's old hat and one of Ruthie's worn dresses. They laughed until they cried when the wind set the sleeves flapping like wings. Osric finished the room before the first rain. He carved a shelf for each child's things and built a chest for Odessa's linens, inlaid with a single strip of walnut. She lined it with lavender and tucked the fiddle inside, newly strung and tuned. They slept side by side each night, the windows open to the sound of frogs and wind, their hands always finding each other beneath the quilts years past. Ruthie learned to read by lamplight, her voice soft and clear. Reuben took over the horses, training them with patience he'd grown into. They added a smokehouse, a new hen coop, and 2 more rooms when the family grew. But no matter how wide the house stretched or how tall the children stood, Osric and Odessa began each day the same, sharing coffee in the early light, her hand resting over his, no words needed. The land never stopped being hard and the wind never softened, but the quiet no longer meant loneliness. It meant peace. It meant belonging, and for the rest of their days they belonged to each other completely.